Hey guys, Edward here from Edward79, the mixed content creator. Now, Europe is easily one of the world's most diverse regions. For being the second smallest continent in the world, only behind the land down under that is Australia. Europe is jam-packed with peoples, languages, cultures, and countries. So in this compilation, I'll be compiling all of my favorite videos about the European continent. To start this competition off to a strong start, Europe has lots of very well-known urban areas. And while even the largest European cities aren't anywhere near as big as large urban areas in other areas like Latin America and especially Asia, these European metropolitan areas are still very much worth talking about. So the first stop on this for this video, the top 10 largest urban centers on the European continent. Europe. For its size, it's really densely populated, but some cities have a lot more people than others. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the top 10 most populated cities in Europe. So without further ado, let's get to the list. First up on this list is the Austrian capital, Vienna, a city that's both greener and cleaner than some other cities on this list like London and Paris. Vienna is also a cultural hotspot, with the city even being called the City of Music, and rightfully so. Historically, back during the Habsburgs' rule in Austria, Vienna was a thriving capital with a perfect environment for musicians and artists to write music that would last throughout the ages, giving Austria's capital a reputation as one of Europe's music hotspots. Not only that, but the city also goes by the name the City of Dreams, because the city was home to the first psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. And with the vibrant culture scene combined with cleanliness and overall great living, it's no surprise that Vienna was ranked as the world's second most livable city, just behind Melbourne in Australia, by the Economist Intelligence Unit. The vibrant capital of Austria is the 10th most populous city in Europe, with Vienna's population being around 2 million. Often referred to as the City of Love due to its romantic image and common use as a backdrop in romantic films, books, and other media, Paris proudly held the title as the most visited city in the world. Well, up until it was stolen by Bangkok, Thailand. But even with that loss, France as a whole still holds the title as the world's most visited country, which I talked about in further detail in my top 10 most visited countries video. Link in the description. But Paris doesn't just go by the nickname the City of Love. It's also sometimes referred to as the City of Lights. It's due either to it being among Europe's first cities to start using gas lamps, or due to Paris being a major hub of the ideas and ideologies that would fuel the Enlightenment. And even crazier, you can actually find Roman ruins in Paris, as the modern location of the city was once part of the Roman region of Gaul, which encompassed France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, as well as parts of the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. Paris is Europe's 9th most populated city, with the Romance-associated city being home to a population of roughly 2.1 million. Having historically been the flourishing imperial capital of a mighty empire that dominated the Mediterranean, Rome is no stranger to being densely packed, with Rome having actually been the world's very first city to have a population of over 1 million people. And even today, Italy's capital is not just incredibly populated with residents, but also so popular with international tourists, even though the city doesn't get nearly as much tourism as some others like Venice, Barcelona, and Santorini. And although most structures from the days of ancient Rome didn't survive the test of time intact, one amazingly actually did survive in pristine condition into the present day: the Pantheon. Not to be confused with the Parthenon in Greece, the Pantheon in Rome is the only ancient building to be intact, to remain intact into the present day, and is widely considered the best preserved building from the ancient world. Archaeological sites turned tourist attractions aside, Rome holds the title as Europe's 8th most populous city, with a population numbering around 2.74 million people. One of, if not the only city on this list that is a population hub but not a major tourist attraction, the Ukrainian capital Kiev was not very well known. Up until that, invasion by Russia and annexation of Crimea and the Donbass. But boy, is there a lot to know about it. Like that Kiev is actually one of the oldest cities in Eastern Europe, having been founded around the 5th century CE and having a history going back over for 1,400 years. The city also goes by the nickname the City of Golden Domes, due to the abundance of churches and cathedrals topped with golden domes, some of which, like the St. Sophia's Cathedral, are actually UNESCO World Heritage sites due to their beautiful architecture and religious significance. And even though Kiev is the capital of Ukraine today, it was once the capital of the Kievan Rus, which eventually led to not just modern Ukraine, but also its not-so-friendly neighbors, Russia and Belarus. Kiev is ranked as the 7th most populated city in Europe, with the city being home to a population of roughly 2.95 million people. As the thriving Spanish capital with a lot to offer for locals and tourists alike, Madrid has actually held the title as the capital of Spain for a long time, as the city has been Spain's capital since the 17th century, officially replacing nearby Toledo as the Spanish capital back in the year 1560. And even stranger, it wasn't even the European Spaniards that founded the city, as Madrid was actually established by the Arabs, specifically by Emir Muhammad, who established Madrid, which was then called Mayrit, as part of a chain of military settlements to defend the Islamic Empire's northern border from the Christian kingdoms in other areas of Europe in 865 CE. Even still, the Arabs were eventually kicked out of Spain during the Reconquista. But even with the Muslims out, the city continued to thrive and is today one of Europe's population hotspots, as Madrid is the 6th most populous city in Europe, with a population of 3.33 million people. Often considered the least German city in Germany, the German capital Berlin has lots of international influence, as Berlin is a crazy popular destination with expats. But what's really crazy is that the city is actually even older than the nation of Germany itself, as the city of Berlin was founded back in 1237, while the unification of Germany into a single nation didn't take place until 1871, which means that, if you do the math, Berlin is a whopping 634 years older than unified Germany. But that's not the only thing this strange German city has to offer. For example, it's actually home to more museums than there are rainy days in the city, as Berlin has 180 museums, while only getting roughly 106 rainy days annually. And even though Bavaria, more specifically Munich, is often associated with beer, Berlin packs a punch too, with the German capital while actually being home to the world's longest beer garden, and having a solid 1,000 late-night stores to get cheap beer at all hours. Berlin is Europe's 5th most populated city, with the not terribly German capital of Germany having a population of 3.75 million people. As the then capital of and second largest city in Russia, St. Petersburg was actually known as Petrograd for a while. Because the name St. Petersburg sounded too German, because remember, the renaming of the city took place during World War I, when Russia's main enemy was, you guessed it, the Germans. But it was actually renamed a second time to Leningrad after the death of Vladimir Lenin, and finally a third time back to St. Petersburg in 1991. This means the city was renamed not once, not twice, but thrice. But that's not the only thing this culture capital of Russia has to offer. For example, did you know that the St. Petersburg subway is actually one of the world's deepest, with the deepest station, Admiraltskaya, or however you're supposed to pronounce that, being 86 meters underground, or 282 feet for you Americans watching. The only subway stations that are deeper are in Kiev in Ukraine and North Korea, where they were intentionally made so deep in case of war. The cultural capital of Russia is also Europe's 4th most populous city, with a population of around 5.6 million people. Technically the capital of 2 countries instead of just one, London is technically the capital of both the UK and England, a constituent country in the UK alongside Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. As far as the famous Big Ben clock tower goes, you might be surprised to know that Big Ben isn't actually the real name, with the tower's actual name having been St. Stephen's Tower up until 2012, when it was renamed to Elizabeth Tower on the occasion of Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee. And if you've ever watched my top 10 largest economies, or whatever it's called, video, link is also in the description, you probably know that London is one of the world's biggest financial hubs, right up there with New York City across the pond in the US. Yes, which is in something I like to call an quote-unquote economic arms race with London for the title of the world's biggest financial hub. Sometimes it's London, and sometimes it's NYC, so neither holds the title for terribly long against the other. London is the 3rd most populous city in Europe, with London being home to a population roughly 8.92 million people strong. The current capital of Russia that replaced St. Petersburg in 1918, Moscow, actually has a few things that are strange up its sleeve that you might not expect at first glance. Like that the famous, or should I say infamous after the invasion of Ukraine, Kremlin in Moscow wasn't always red. It was actually white when it was first built, but only in the 19th century was the color changed to red. And even crazier, the dead body of Vladimir Lenin is actually preserved in a mausoleum in the city's red space, with keeping his corpse in mint condition actually costing the Russian Federation roughly, get this, 13 million rubles annually. That's 210,000 US dollars or 155,000 euros spent annually just to keep Lenin's dead body looking natural. On a not as gross but equally strange note, only about 2% of the Russian capital's population is actually quote-unquote from Moscow, with the vast majority being either immigrants or coming from other Russian cities. Even so, Moscow takes the title as Europe's 2nd most populous city, with the capital of Russia being home to roughly 13.15 million people. But before we get to the number one most populated city in Europe, here are some honorable mentions. Minsk, Belarus, 1.99 million people. Hamburg, Germany, 1.89 million people. Warsaw, Poland, 1.86 million people. Bucharest, Romania, 1.74 million people. Belgrade, Serbia, 1.68 million people. And now, finally, we come to Istanbul in Turkey. And while I generally consider Turkey to be in Asia and not Europe, Istanbul is technically in both continents. But for this list's sake, I'm counting it as a European city. And get this, Istanbul is the only transcontinental city in the entire world. Yes, no other city on Earth is split between two continents, with Istanbul being split into European and Asian parts by the Bosphorus Strait. And which continent you're on depends on which side of the strait you're on. If you're on the western side, you're in Europe. If you're on the eastern side, you're in Asia. And although it was the historic capital of three empires, the Eastern Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman empires, Istanbul is actually not the modern Turkish capital. No, that honor goes to Ankara, which replaced Istanbul as the capital in 1930 after the formation of the Republic of Turkey. Istanbul is technically Europe's most populated city, with the not Turkish capital having a population numbering around 15.65 million people. Okay, so I talked about the largest European cities, but what about the largest countries on the continent? Well, this next video has you covered, as our next stop is an oldie but goodie of mine about the top 10 largest nation-states in Europe. Now, Europe is by no means a big continent, and being the second smallest of Earth's continents behind Australia, Europe is by far the continent most densely packed with countries for its size. But even amongst the teeny tiny countries like Monaco, Andorra, Liechtenstein, and the Vatican, there are giants that, while tiny on a global scale, are absolutely massive when you zoom down to the European scale. So without further ado, here are the 10 largest countries on the European continent. A country of rich culture, delicious food, and fine wine, Italy happens to be the 5th most visited country in the world, and is incredibly popular with tourists from all over Europe and the US. And rightfully so, as tourism in Italy employs more than 2 million Italians, and makes the country millions of euros annually, with tourism accounting for roughly 13% of the country's GDP. Weirdly enough, Italy also has not one, but 2 microstates inside of it, San Marino and the Vatican. And here's something you probably didn't know. Christopher Columbus, yes, that same dude famous for discovering the Americas, was actually Italian, having been born in the city of Genoa in what's now Italy. Fun facts aside, even though the microstates inside Italy are tiny, the country itself is comparatively huge, with the country having a total area of 301,318 square kilometers. A country frequently regarded as Europe's giant punching bag, Poland, despite its size, was invaded in both world wars, successfully no less. But invasions aside, vodka, even though most notably drank in Russia, is actually not of Russian origin, but instead was actually invented in Poland. Poland isn't as dependent on tourism as most other European countries, even though it holds some pretty impressive feats to this day, like having the world's biggest castle and being home to many of Europe's largest animals, most notably the European bison, a species once on the brink of extinction that's now making a comeback, just like its American counterpart. And wouldn't you know it, the country with the most of them is Poland. Poland is a little bit bigger than Italy, with the country's total area being 312,685 square kilometers. Well known for holding the record of being the happiest country in the world for 6 years straight, Finland has a lot of reasons behind its happiness. Finland has an excellent education system, universal, not free however, healthcare, and several other services that all contribute to how happy the country is. And as if that wasn't enough, the capital of Finland, Helsinki, actually has the cleanest air of anywhere in the world. And Finland also holds other impressive feats. For example, Finns drink the most coffee of anywhere on Earth. The country has 2 million saunas, and yes, Finland has been the happiest country on Earth for 6 years straight. And considering the excellent services, the high levels of trust between Finns and the locals' appreciation of the simple things in life, it's not a huge surprise. Finland is the 8th biggest country in Europe, with Finland's total area being 338,145 square kilometers. Well known for its, less than peaceful past in both world wars, Germany today is nowhere near as violent as its past predecessors, Nazi Germany and the German Empire. German culture incorporates beer a lot, from the Oktoberfest to having the world's oldest brewery, and even having a secret beer code to order the drink. Germany, however, is not the country that drinks the most beer. That honor can go either to China, which has the highest overall beer consumption, or the Czech Republic, which has the highest per capita consumption. German is also the 5th most taught foreign language in the world, being beaten by Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, French, and English, and is spoken in not just Germany, but also Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Austria, and Luxembourg. Germany is one of the biggest countries in the European continent, with Germany having a total land area of 357,386 square kilometers. As one of the richest countries in the entire world, Norway has successfully managed to avoid the problems that usually plague countries with a lot of oil, most notably Venezuela. Norway is in what's known as the Nordics, a group of countries in Northern Europe that includes Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, one of which will appear further down this list. Norway is also incredibly safe to visit and live in, although I should warn you that you may find Norwegians rather cold if you come from a more gregarious culture, as the Nordics in general tend to be reserved and keep to themselves. And just like all of the Nordics, the country made the list of the top 10 happiest countries in the world yet again, with Norway ranking 7th in 2023. Norway is also rather big, with Norway having a total land area of 385,178 square kilometers. Traveling not very far at all, next up on this list is Sweden. The land border between Sweden and Norway is the longest in Europe, with the Norway-Sweden border having a total length of 1,620 kilometers. And if you wanted to know something really weird, Sweden actually imports garbage. That's right, because Swedish people generate very little garbage, there's no longer very much waste for Sweden to incinerate for energy. So as a solution, Sweden actually imports garbage from Norway and the UK to fuel the country's incinerators, which are used as the primary source of energy instead of oil and other fossil fuels. 49% of Sweden's waste ends up being incinerated, with 50% being recycled or composted, and the remaining only 1% of Sweden's garbage ending up in a landfill. Oh, and 57% of Sweden is still forested. So if a clean environment is what you're looking for, Sweden is the perfect place to find it. Sweden holds the title as the 5th largest country in Europe, with the country's total land area being 447,425 square kilometers. Claiming the title as the fourth largest country in Europe and second most visited country in the world, we'll get to the most visited country in a second, is Spain. Spain's national anthem is the Marcha Real, which translates to Royal March, but that's not what's weird about it. What's weird is that the Spanish national anthem has no words. Yup, Spain is one of only 4 countries in the world whose national anthems have no words, with the others being Kosovo, San Marino, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Spain is also the world's largest producer of olive oil, producing just about twice as much as the next biggest producer, Italy. And as far as bullfighting, it is legal in most of Spain, except in the provinces of Catalonia and the Canary Islands. Other countries have also outlawed the practice, but I'm not going to get too deep in that. Like I said, Spain is huge, with the country's total land area being 498,511 square kilometers. The most visited country in the world and third largest in Europe, France has a lot to offer, from the Eiffel Tower to the Louvre, as well as food and fine wine. Given all of this, it comes as no surprise France is the single most visited country in the world, and a popular destination for tourists from all over the world. There's a lot of food-related quirks in this country, including the fact that French supermarkets aren't actually allowed to throw away food too close to the best by date and instead donate it to charity or food banks, or that France produces over 1,500 types of cheese, or that the French eat over 25,000 tons of escargot, that's snails by the way, annually. But going back to size, France is the largest country in the European Union and third largest in Europe, with France having a total area of 551,695 square kilometers. Now, despite the recent Russian annexation of the regions of Crimea and Donbass, these regions are still legally Ukrainian, so I will still count Crimea and the Donbass region as part of Ukraine. But war business aside, Ukraine has a surprising lot of culture under its belt. You know Chernobyl, right? Well, that nuclear disaster occurred in Ukraine, and you can actually visit that site, although you will need a permit. But nuclear waste aside, this country is also called the breadbasket of Europe, and rightfully so, as Ukraine is not only one of the largest exporters of wheat, barley, and corn, but is also the biggest producer of sunflower seeds and sunflower oil. Not surprising, considering the sunflower is Ukraine's national flower. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, with a total area of 603,628 square kilometers. Finally, we come to the Russian Federation, the biggest country in Europe and the world. Not too surprisingly, Russia is a transcontinental country, with Russia spanning both Europe and Asia. 40% of Europe's area is occupied by the European portion of Russia, which, mind you, also contains 75% of Russia's population, and largely due to the fact that the Asian part of Russia, what we'd call Siberia, is basically an unlivable frozen hellhole for most of the year. 2 of the biggest cities in Russia, the capital Moscow and as well as St. Petersburg, are located in European Russia, as is 9 other cities out of 13 in Russia that have over 1 million residents. And speaking of Moscow, I bet you didn't know that Moscow has the most billionaires per capita of any city. And as you may already know, Russia is huge. The European portion alone has an area of 3,969,100 square kilometers, let alone the entire country's gigantic area of 17,071,242 square kilometers, making Russia not only the biggest country in Europe, but also the biggest country in the world. Now, I've talked about both the largest cities and the largest countries on the European continent. But for this next video, my scope will be narrowed to just the European Union, as the next stop on this European-themed compilation is part 1 of my series, The Official Languages of the EU Explained. The European Union is by far one of the most powerful economic alliances in the world, and with 27 member states and a total GDP not far from that of the entire US, you'd better believe it's true. But while all the EU member states are united under the Union, the local languages aren't. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the local languages of the EU, where they're spoken, and how many speakers there are in the countries where the language is official. Before we get started, however, this is a two-part series, as covering all 24 languages of the EU would most likely take way too long. So in this video, we'll only cover 12 of the 24 languages, official languages of the EU, with the other 12 going to be covered in part 2 next week, or whenever I get to it. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Going alphabetically from A to Z, first up we have Bulgarian, the official language of, you guessed it, Bulgaria, officially known as the Republic of Bulgaria. It's a Slavic language that, similar to other Slavic languages, uses the Cyrillic alphabet, with the exceptions being the West Slavic languages of Czech, Slovak, and Polish, only one of which will appear later in this video, with the other two being reserved for part 2. Bulgarian is spoken by roughly 2% of the EU's population, 6.95 million of whom reside in Bulgaria, as well as those living in neighboring Greece and Romania. Sticking to southeastern Europe and the Balkan Peninsula, next up is Croatian, the official language of Croatia, formerly officially known as the Republic of Croatia, and official at a subnational level in, get this, Austria, in which German is the actual official language nationally. Croatian is yet another Slavic language in the same language branch as Bulgarian, the South Slavic languages, alongside Bosnian and Serbian, neither of which will appear here in this video, nor will they appear in part 2, because neither Serbia nor Bosnia and Herzegovina are in the EU. Croatian is spoken by approximately 1% of the EU's population, of whom 5 million live in Croatia. Moving further north and west for this one, next up is Czech, the official language of the Czech Republic and official at a subnational level in neighboring Slovakia, in which Slovak is the official language nationally. Unlike the previous two, Czech is a West Slavic language and does not use the Cyrillic alphabet, instead using a Latin script not that different from the English alphabet, similar to the other West Slavic languages. And like I said, Slovak and Polish will not appear in this video but will be spoken about in part 2. Czech is spoken by roughly 3% of the European Union's population, 10.6 million of whom reside in the Czech Republic. Now heading north into Scandinavia, next in this video is Danish, which is the official language of the Kingdom of Denmark, or just Denmark for you normal people out there. It's also an official language at a subnational level in neighboring Germany to the south, in which 21,200 Danish speakers are to be found. Unlike the previous three languages, which are Slavic languages, Danish is a Germanic language in the Nordic branch, alongside Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic. Danish is spoken by only about 1% of the population of the EU, 5.4 million of whom are in Denmark, while the rest has to largely reside in Sweden. Heading back south to the Benelux countries, next in line is Dutch, the official language of not one, but two countries, Belgium and the Netherlands. or officially known as the Kingdom of Belgium and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Like Danish, Dutch is in the Germanic language family, but unlike Danish, it's part of the West Germanic branch, alongside German and English. Dutch speakers make up roughly 6% of the EU's population, 16 million of whom live in the Netherlands, and 7 million of whom live in Belgium. Surprisingly, however, the Netherlands is also home to a lot of English speakers, as a whopping, get this, 95% of the Dutch population is fluent in English. And speaking of English, next up, the third most spoken language in the world, held behind Spanish and Mandarin Chinese, English, which is the official language of Ireland and Malta, or officially known as the Republic of Ireland and the Republic of Malta. Outside the EU, however, English has an even bigger native population, especially when including Anglophone giants like the US and India. But even without them, English is still the most widely spoken language in the EU, with roughly 44% of the EU's population speaking English, 1.56 million of whom are in Ireland and 520,000 of whom are in Malta, with the rest of the English-speaking population of the EU being spread out between Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, Austria, and Sweden, among other countries. Moving on from a language spoken literally just about everywhere to a language that isn't very impressive at that. Next up is Estonian, the official language of Estonia, officially known as the Republic of Estonia. Now, Estonian is kind of an odd one out here, as unlike the previous 6 languages I spoke about, Estonian is not an Indo-European language, instead belonging to the Uralic family alongside 2 others in this video that'll be mentioned later. Of the European Union's total population, though, less than 1% speak Estonian, with Estonia having a total of only about 922,000 native speakers, making it the 4th least spoken language in the EU. Now moving on even further up north, next up we have Finnish, the official language of the Republic of Finland and Kingdom of Sweden, or just Finland and Sweden for you normal people. And while you might think Finnish is a Nordic language, you'd actually be dead wrong, as Finnish is only one of 4 languages in the EU that aren't Indo-European, as Finnish is actually an Uralic language, not a Nordic language like Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. And similar to Estonian, Finnish won't exactly get you far, as Finnish speakers only make up about 1% of the total population of the EU, with Finland having about 4.78 million of them and the rest largely living in Sweden. Next up, French, which in the EU is the official language of France, hence Belgium and Luxembourg, or officially known as the French Republic, Kingdom of Belgium, and Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Now, unlike all the languages I previously spoke about, French is a Romance language, so named because French, alongside 4 other languages, split off from Latin during the fall of the Roman Empire. And like English, French has a huge speaker base outside the EU, but even within, 30% of the European Union's population speaks French, roughly 53.6 million of whom are in France, 9.6 million of whom live in Belgium, and 590,800 of whom live in Luxembourg, leaving it only behind German and English in terms of speakers in the EU. While not having that big of a speaker base outside of Europe, within Europe, more specifically the EU for this video, German is the official language of 4 countries: Austria, Belgium, Germany, and Luxembourg, or officially known as the Republic of Austria, Kingdom of Belgium, Federal Republic of Germany and Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. German is one of the languages in what I like to call the quote-unquote Big Three, with the other two being English and French, so grouped together because as these three languages are the most spoken and hold the most linguistic power in the EU, with German being the second most spoken language in the EU behind English, as German is spoken by 36% of the EU's population. 80.6 million of whom reside in Germany, 8.8 million of whom reside in Austria, 390,000 of whom live in Luxembourg, and 75,000 of whom live in Belgium. Next up, and the next to last language for part 1, Greek, which is the official language of Greece and Cyprus, officially known as the Hellenic Republic and the Republic of Cyprus. And here's a fact you probably did not know. Greek is actually the only surviving language in its branch, that being the Hellenic language branch, with the rest of the languages in its branch having gone extinct. Greek is the 11th most spoken language in the European Union, with Greek speakers making up around 3% of the EU's population, 10.7 million of whom reside in Greece, and 650,000 of whom live in Cyprus. Lastly, for part 1 is Hungarian, the official language of Hungary, officially known as the Republic of Hungary, and being official at a sub-national level in Austria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Remember when I said that there were 4 official languages in the EU that aren't Indo-European languages? Well, Hungarian is the third one, and the third Uralic language that's official in the EU, alongside Estonian and Finnish. Hungarian is the 9th most spoken language in the EU, with 3% of the EU's population being composed of Hungarian speakers, of whom more than 9.8 million live in Hungary. Now, that was part 1 of the series, but if you thought that was it, think again, because the next stop on this compilation is part 2 of the official languages of the EU explained. Now, in my last video, I spoke about 12 of the European Union's 24 official languages, which is in part 1 of this 2-part series about the languages of the EU. And so in this video, you guessed it, I'll be talking about the other 12 in part 2 of the official languages of the EU explained. So without further ado, let's get into the list. First up for part 2 is a language most of you probably don't know about, Irish. It's the official language of Ireland, or the Republic of Ireland, and there's actually a pretty good, albeit kind of sad reason you probably don't know about it. And it all has to do with the Brits. The English invaded Ireland back in the late 12th century, and when it happened, English slowly took over as the dominant language, and very well is today, even decades after Irish independence from Britain. Unsurprisingly as such, Irish is not a very widely spoken language, with less than 1% of the EU's population speaking it, 1,873,997 of whom live in Ireland. And while that seems like a lot of people, that's only about 40% of the Irish population. Moving on from a sleeper language most people don't even know about to one of the most popular foreign languages here in the US. Next up we have Italian, which is the official language of Italy, officially known as the Republic of Italy or Italian Republic, and is official at a sub-national level in Slovenia and Croatia. Similar to many other languages in the EU, Italian doesn't have a large speaker base outside of Europe, with most all of the other Italian speakers not in Italy being in nearby countries, such as the microstates of San Marino and the Vatican, as well as the Italian-speaking parts of Switzerland. In the EU, however, the language is actually the fourth most spoken behind only French, German, and English, with 15% of the EU's population being Italian speakers, 58 million of whom are in Italy. Now onto a language that unfortunately doesn't really have that much to talk about, Latvian. It's the official language of the Republic of Latvia, or just Latvia for you normal people watching this. It's a Baltic language alongside Lithuanian, and while you'd think Estonian would be on here, I already cleared up in my last video that Estonian is in the Uralic language family alongside Hungarian and Finnish, but I digress. Latvian is also not that common, with less than 1% of the EU's population speaking Latvian, of whom 1.2 million live in Latvia. Now moving further south, but staying in the Baltic states, next up is Lithuanian, the official language of Lithuania, officially known as the Republic of Lithuania, and official at a sub-national level in Poland. Similar to Latvian, there isn't much to talk about, as it doesn't really have very much influence outside of Lithuania. But like I said earlier, it's a sister language to Latvian, with both being Baltic language, rather obviously excluding Estonian, like I said, when I talked about Latvian, because I'll say it again, Estonian is an Uralic language, not a Baltic one. Lithuanian is actually more common than both Estonian and Latvian, with roughly 1% of the EU's population speaking the language, 2.8 million of whom are in Lithuania. And yet another very restrictive language on this list, Maltese is the official language of the Republic of Malta, or just Malta, in which you might remember that English is also an official language there, from part 1, and it is. But what's really intriguing is that despite being right next to Italy, Maltese isn't a Romance language, instead being in the Semitic language family, which in terms of language families actually makes Maltese closer to Arabic than to Italian, making it one of only 4 languages in the EU that aren't Indo-European, with the other 3 being Estonian, Hungarian, and Finnish. Maltese is probably the least spoken language in the EU, with less than 1% of the EU's population speaking it, and Malta only having 450,000 speakers. Next in line for this video is Polish, the official language of Poland, officially known as the Republic of Poland. Now, when I talked about Czech back in part 1, I mentioned that Czech is a West Slavic language, with the language branch having 2 other languages that would be mentioned here. And yes, if you remember from last week's video, Polish was one of them. As well as that, I mentioned one other language that will also appear on this video. Polish is the 6th most spoken language in the European Union, as Polish is spoken by roughly 10% of the EU's population, 38 million of whom live in Poland. Heading both west and south for this next one, next up is Portuguese, the official language of Portugal, which is officially known as the Portuguese Republic. It seems very similar to Spanish, and rightfully so, as Spanish and Portuguese are very close cousins, with both languages falling under the Romance language family alongside French, Romanian, Italian, and the lesser recognized Iberian languages. And yes, most Portuguese speakers live outside of Europe, with Brazil alone having a whopping 205 million of them, more than 10 times Portugal's count. That said, Portuguese speakers still make up around 3% of the EU's population, with Portugal accounting for about 10 million of them. Now heading east all the way to the Balkans, next up is Romanian, the official language of Romania, officially known as well, I couldn't actually find the official name, so I'll just leave it at Romania. Like I said in my top 10 easiest languages for English speakers video, link in the description below, Romanian is surprisingly easy for sounding so exotic. Although this is because, again, Romanian shares close ties to Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese. Romanian is spoken by 6% of the EU's population, of whom Romania is home to 16.19 million of them. Next up, it's back up north, as next up is Slovak, the official language of the Slovak Republic, or Slovakia for you normal people watching, and being official at a sub-national level in Hungary and the Czech Republic. Now, when I spoke about Polish earlier in this video, I mentioned there'd be one more language in the West Slavic branch that's official in the EU, and Slovak is exactly what I was talking about, with the only actual South Slavic language in this video coming not that much later actually. Slovak speakers make up about 2% of the EU's population, with 4.65 million of them in Slovakia, 200,000 of them in the Czech Republic, and 5.1 thousand of them in Hungary. Earlier on, I mentioned that only one language in the South Slavic branch would appear in this video, and Slovene, also known as Slovenian, is exactly what I was talking about, which is the official language of Slovenia, officially the Republic of Slovenia. Similar to the West Slavic languages, Slovene refuses to use the Cyrillic alphabet, instead basing their alphabet on the Latin one used in many Western European languages. Slovene is even less common in the EU than Slovak, with less than 1% of the European Union's population being composed of Slovenian speakers, of whom 1.92 million live in Slovenia. And yet another language with a gigantic non-European speaker base. Next up is Spanish, the official language of the Kingdom of Spain, or just Spain. Like I said before, Spanish has a huge speaker base outside of Europe, with Mexico having the largest Spanish-speaking population, followed by the US in second place and Colombia in third, with Spain only having the fourth largest Spanish-speaking population in the world. And as for why the US is so high, I'd assume it's from a combination of 1. The US has a much larger population than Spain, and 2. Recent influxes of, let's just say, undocumented migrants from Latin America into the US. Even back in Europe, however, Spanish speakers make up 17% of the EU's population, 4.8 million of whom live in Spain. Last, but certainly not least, we have Swedish, the official language of the Kingdom of Sweden and Republic of Finland, or just Sweden and Finland. It's very similar to Norwegian and Danish, and while I mentioned Danish in part 1, I didn't mention Norwegian once, because it isn't one of the EU's official languages. But I digress. The language has very close ties to the other Nordic languages, as Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic are all in the North Germanic language branch. And yeah, sorry Finland, but Finnish is an Uralic language, not a Germanic one. Swedish is spoken by around 3% of the EU's population, of whom Sweden has 9.39 million of them, and Finland has 289,000. Finally, to end this compilation on a much more recent note, my most recent video that isn't this one. part 1 of my Every Country in the European Union Explained series. The European Union, an economic alliance between a grand total of 27 member states, sorry UK, and combines the markets of its member states into one major market on the world stage. But what is it that defines each country of the European Union and makes each one unique in its own ways? This is part 1 of a series in which I explain every country that's currently a member in the EU. Sorry, UK, but Brexit was your fault after all. So without further ado, let's get into it. Belgium. A constitutional monarchy smashed between the likes of fellow EU members France, Germany, and the Netherlands, Belgium's 3 primary languages are rather predictable due to its neighbors. The 2 primarily spoken languages of Belgium are Dutch, spoken in the northern region of Flanders, and French, spoken in the southern region of Wallonia, or as some people know it, the Walloon territory. And then the 3rd main language, German, is much less common, and only really spoken in the areas bordering Germany and the far east of the country. Like most countries in Europe, Belgium is, religion-wise, predominantly Christian, but more specifically predominantly Catholic, similar to its southern neighbor France as opposed to heavy Protestant influence in the Netherlands and northern Germany. But like its neighbor the Netherlands, Belgium is a constitutional monarchy, in which the ruling monarch has basically no political power, and the role is essentially really only ceremonial. Instead, most of the political power is held by an elected official, which in Belgium's case is the Prime Minister. The Belgian flag has 3 vertical stripes, with the colors being in order from left to right, or vice versa, because I honestly couldn't care less. Black, yellow, and red. And no, it does not look like a sideways German flag, as the order of Germany's flag colors from top to bottom goes black, red, gold, while the color order of a sideways Belgian flag goes black, a lighter shade of yellow, and red. Economically, Belgium is about average, with the country having both the 7th largest economy in the EU in terms of overall GDP, and being the 7th richest country in the organization in terms of GDP per capita, but the aligning numbers are more than likely just a coincidence. The country, like most EU members, uses the euro as its currency, and the nation's capital, Brussels, is actually where the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are located, and the country was a founding member of both organizations. Belgium, alongside the other quote-unquote inner 6 countries, which I'll talk about later, founded the European Economic Community via the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which would eventually lead to the modern European Union in 1993. France. The first major European republic in history, and another one of the inner 6 countries that initially founded the economic community that would become the EU. France, like Belgium, was a founding member of both NATO and the EU, even though, as I said earlier, the headquarters of both organizations are in Brussels, Belgium. Now, compared to many of its neighbors, France became a republic much sooner than the rest of Europe via the French Revolution, and since then, France has had a long history of strong republicanism. Hell, the nation's literal national day on July 14 celebrates one of the key events of the French Revolution, the storming of a prison in Paris by a name you've probably heard of, the Bastille. Like basically all other European republics, France has both a president, which is the head of state, and a prime minister, which is the head of the government, with both president and prime minister being elected officials. The French flag has that classic tricolor you probably all know and love, which goes from left to right, or right to left, because honestly I couldn't care less. It's blue, white, and red. These three colors were symbolic of republicanism in France during the French Revolution. And even today, this trifecta of colors still have strong symbolism as a symbol of a thriving French Republic. However, there are technically two versions of the French flag. The first is this one right here that has a lighter color scheme, while the other version, which I do not have on display, it has a darker color scheme. As for language, of course, French is the only official language, though there are several other regional languages that are also recognized by the French government. The country's capital of Paris is extremely well known all over the world, especially now at the time I'm filming this due to the 2024 Olympic Games being held there. However, France also has other notably large cities, including Marseille, Lyon, Toulouse, Strasbourg, and Bordeaux. But even of France's large metropolitan areas, Paris still stands out as the largest city in the nation by a country mile, and by far the most well-known of France's large urban areas outside of France. And although the country is predominantly Christian, but more specifically Catholic, France also has a notable Muslim minority, with followers of the Islamic faith making up anywhere from 4 to 10% of the French population. As for currency and the economy, like most of the EU, France uses the euro and has the second largest economy in terms of overall GDP in the post-Brexit EU, only behind Germany's. In terms of GDP per capita, though, France just barely squeezes into the top 10, with France in 11th place in the EU for GDP per capita. France, being one of the inner six nations, was one of the 6 founding members of what would become the EU, the EEC, which was founded by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Luxembourg. The second smallest member of the EU in terms of area, only behind Malta, Luxembourg might be small, but it's also so filthy rich, with Luxembourg having the highest GDP per capita in the entire European Union. In terms of overall GDP and size of economy, however, the country's size is more of a detriment than a benefit, as the nation actually has the 8th smallest economy in the EU in terms of overall GDP. Currency-wise, Luxembourg, being an EU member, uses the euro, though not all countries in the European Union do. In terms of government, Luxembourg is technically a constitutional monarchy, but instead of having a king or queen like most other European constitutional monarchies, the country instead has a Grand Duke, making it the only Grand Duchy in the entire world. And while the Luxembourgish Grand Duke isn't a total figurehead like other European monarchs, the vast majority of the political power still falls in the hands of an elected official, that being the Prime Minister. Religion-wise, Luxembourg, like most of Europe, is predominantly Christian, with the Christian population of the country being overwhelmingly Catholic. And as for languages, Luxembourgish is the main official language, but there are 2 other official languages in Luxembourg, French and German, though English and even Portuguese aren't too rare either, as I mentioned in my video about the countries in Europe with the most English speakers. Link to that in the description below. Strangely enough, the capital of Luxembourg is named, well, Luxembourg, though some people prefer to say Luxembourg City, likely to differentiate between the country and the capital city of said country. As for the nation's flag, it's 3 horizontal stripes, with the colors being, from top to bottom, red, white, and blue. It's similar to, but not identical to, the Dutch flag, as the flag of Luxembourg generally has a much lighter color scheme than the Dutch flag, which in general has a much darker color scheme. Another one of the inner six nations, Luxembourg was yet another founding member of the European Economic Community, which would eventually become the EU. Germany. The economic beating heart of the EU, right in the center of the alliance. Germany was not only one of the founding members of the EEC, which would become the EU, and uses the euro like most of the European Union, but is also economically really impressive, with Germany having the largest economy in the EU and Europe and third largest economy worldwide, passing Japan and being only behind China and the US. In terms of GDP per capita, though, Germany is less impressive, but still very much so, with Germany having the 9th largest GDP per capita in the European Union. As for governance, the nation is a republic, with the Federal Republic of Germany, or Bundesrepublik Deutschland in German, having both a president and a chancellor, which is essentially the equivalent of a prime minister but under a different name. Now, unlike France, which is a semi-presidential republic, Germany is a parliamentary republic, in which the chancellor isn't elected by the people directly, but by whichever party has the most seats in the Bundestag, or the legislative institution of the German government, and that is directly elected by the people. Unlike in presidential or semi-presidential republics, Germany's parliamentary republic means that the head of state, that is, the German president, has basically no political power, and the role is largely ceremonial, while the chancellor is actually the one that holds the political power. Linguistically, German is the only official language, though there are several regional dialects that I am not going to go into. And religion-wise, there's a pretty even split. Northern Germany is predominantly Protestant, while southern Germany, primarily the states of Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, is predominantly Catholic. And then there's the former East Germany, which has the highest concentration of non-religious people in the country. Never mind a sizable Muslim minority due to immigration from the Muslim world. And going back to economy, it's also a pretty uneven split, with the former East Germany being nowhere near as prosperous as the West, though the East slowly but surely is catching up in that regard. This divide can also be seen in the German capital Berlin, with the former West Berlin in general being more prosperous than the former East Berlin, and cities in the West like Munich, Hamburg, Nuremberg, and Frankfurt tending to be larger and richer than cities in East Germany, like Erfurt, Magdeburg, Potsdam, and Dresden. As for the flag, the design is simple. 3 horizontal stripes with the colors from top to bottom being black, red, and gold. Yet another founding member of the European Economic Community, Germany was another nation in the Inner Six original founders of the EEC, the predecessor to the EU. The Netherlands. Incorrectly referred to as Holland by some, the Netherlands primarily speaks, Dutch. But the thing is, the language is slowly starting to decline as English becomes incredibly widespread in the country. This does not mean Dutch is in danger of dying by any means, as Dutch is still widely spoken in the Netherlands, and in some other areas, like Flanders, which is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, and even the former Dutch colony of Suriname, despite the widespread speaking of English by Dutch people. Like in a lot of Northern Europe, non-religion is really common in the Netherlands, with over half the Dutch population being atheist, agnostic, or otherwise irreligious. Apart from irreligious people, the next largest group are Catholics, coming in at a not at all close second, then Protestants, followers of other Christian denominations, Muslims, and finally followers of other religions. Like neighboring Belgium, the Netherlands is a constitutional monarchy in which the ruling monarch, which is the head of state, is really almost only ceremonial, while the Prime Minister, which is the head of government, has the bulk of, if not all, of the political power. The Dutch capital Amsterdam is also really well known worldwide, though probably not as well known as some other European capitals like Athens, Rome, London, Moscow, or Paris. But is still far more well known than some other Dutch cities like Groningen and Utrecht. The flag of the Netherlands, like a lot of other world flags, but in Europe especially, uses a basic tricolor: red, white, and blue, who in either the exact same or exact opposite order of what a sideways French flag looks like depending on which way you flip it. Currency-wise, it should not be a surprise that the Netherlands uses the euro, and economically, the country has the 5th largest economy in the EU, only being beaten by Spain, Italy, France, and Germany, and is the 4th richest country in the organization by GDP per capita, only behind Denmark, Ireland, and Luxembourg. The Netherlands is the 5th country of the Inner Six I've talked about in this video, and is one of the founding members of the predecessor to the European Union, the European Economic Community, which was founded via the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Italy. A country well known for its great food, great history, and tourist hotspots throughout, and being the final member of the Inner Six I'll be talking about in this video. Italy was a monarchy for the vast majority of its time as a unified entity, but eventually the monarchy was abolished and a republic was established after an institutional referendum in 1946. The modern Italian Republic, or Repubblica Italiana, I definitely butchered that pronunciation, in Italian, is specifically a parliamentary republic, in which the head of state, that is, the Italian president, is primarily ceremonial, but does appoint the head of the government, that being the Prime Minister, an elected official who has the political power, while the Italian Parliament is primarily responsible for legislative duties. Language-wise, Italy is in a similar situation to France, with Italian being the only official language, but there are also several other regional languages spoken in the country. The Italian flag has a simple but very good design. 3 vertical stripes with 3 colors, those being green, white, and red. There are a few explanations floating around about the symbolism, though. Some say these colors have military symbolism, with the white and red symbolizing Milan, and the green the Milanese civic guard. Others believe that the symbolism is religious, with the green representing hope, the white faith, and the red charity. The most common explanation, though, is the colors representing Italy's history and geography, with the green representing the plains and hills, the white representing the snowy alpine areas in the north that border Switzerland and Austria, and the red the blood spilled in the country's wars of independence. By far, when it comes to religion, Italy is overwhelmingly Catholic, likely due to influence from the Vatican City, which Italy completely surrounds. However, it should also be noted a whopping 11.7% of Italy's population is non-religious, though this is nowhere near as high as in some other countries, and only 2.6% of the nation's populace follow religions other than Christianity. Rome, the capital of Italy, is one of Europe's oldest cities, and as I said in my video about the top 10 most populous European cities, linked to that in the description, Rome was the first city ever to have more than 1 million people. However, Italy also has other large and well-known cities, such as Naples, Venice, Florence, and Milan, that also rake in not just a lot, but occasionally almost too many tourists. Speaking of tourists, tourism is one of the big sectors of the Italian economy, which is the 3rd largest in the EU behind only France and Germany. In terms of GDP per capita, Italy finds itself much further down, only having the 13th largest GDP per capita amongst EU nations. However, just like Germany, Italy also has a major economic divide. Not between East and West, though, but between North and South, as Northern Italy tends to be a lot more economically prosperous than Southern Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily are. Unsurprisingly, Italy uses the euro, but again, not all EU members do, and it's the sixth and final member of the Inner Six that will be talked about in this video and this series, and is one of the 6 founding members of the EU. Ireland. The primary country that controls most of the island of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is actually even younger than Belgium, as while Belgian independence was achieved from the Netherlands in 1830, Ireland achieved its freedom from the thumb of London almost a century later in 1922. The design of the Irish flag is somewhat similar to the Italian flag, with very similar shades of green and white, but the red at the far right of the flag is replaced by orange. Also, keep in mind that the flag of Ireland is, in reality, actually also significantly wider than the Italian flag, and most flags in Europe for that matter. Currency-wise, Ireland uses the euro like most of the EU, and economically, the country is surprisingly impressive, with the Irish economy being the 9th largest in the EU, in the European Union. Where Ireland really never fails to shock me, though, is in GDP per capita, as Ireland has the 2nd largest GDP per capita in the EU, only behind the much smaller country of Luxembourg, as I mentioned earlier in the video. Unlike its only neighbor, the United Kingdom, which is a constitutional monarchy, but is not in the EU, so it won't be talked about in this video, Ireland is a parliamentary republic, with the Irish president as head of state and prime minister being head of government. Said president is one of the constituent parts of the Irish parliament, which goes by the name of that. With the other being the 2 houses of that name, I'm absolutely gonna butcher if I try to say it. Obviously, as with most countries, the capital of Ireland, Dublin, is the most well-known city in the country outside the country. But there are, of course, other relatively large metropolitan areas like Cork in Ireland, just like anywhere else. Religion-wise, Ireland is overwhelmingly Catholic, as opposed to the neighboring UK, which is predominantly Protestant. And although the primary language of the country is English, the native language, Irish, isn't dead yet, and still spoken by a handful of the nation's population, meaning that while it's not dead, it is hanging by a thread. Ireland was one of the first countries to join the EU that isn't one of the Inner 6 founding members, with Ireland joining the EU, well, EEC really, alongside Denmark and the UK, the latter of which would eventually leave and thus will not be talked about in any other part of the series, on January 1st, 1973. Denmark. One of 3 Nordic nations that would join the EEC, which would end up becoming the EU, Denmark, similar to Norway and Sweden, is a constitutional monarchy, in which the Danish monarchy is almost entirely ceremonial, with the ruling monarch as the country's head of state, while the head of government is the prime minister, similar to Europe's other monarchies, 3 of which, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, I've already talked about. The only official language of Denmark, Danish, is very similar to other Nordic languages, such as Norwegian and Swedish, and in their standard forms at least, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are believed to be mutually intelligible with each other, or at the very least, are very similar to each other. And just to be clear, Finnish is not a Nordic language, as it's not even Indo-European, and is closer to other Uralic languages like Hungarian than it is to Swedish or any of the Nordic languages. By a mile, the largest city in Denmark is, unsurprisingly, the capital city of Copenhagen, while several other Danish cities are smaller and far less known about outside Denmark than the giant that is the Danish capital Copenhagen. And even though Denmark is officially a predominantly Lutheran nation, that's because many Danes are indeed registered with the Danish Lutheran Church. But the thing is that not only do most Danes not openly practice a religion despite adhering to it on paper, just like in the rest of Scandinavia, religion is seen as a much more private matter in Denmark than in the US or some other areas of Europe. In terms of currency, Denmark is an outlier in that the nation does not use the euro, instead using the Danish krone as its currency. The flag of Denmark is very similar in design to the other Nordic flags, with a crimson red background and a white cross going through the flag. This general design is known as the Nordic Cross and is used by all 5 Nordic nations. Economically, Denmark has the 11th largest economy in the EU, but ranks much higher in terms of GDP per capita, with the country having the 3rd highest GDP per capita in the European Union, behind only Ireland and Luxembourg. Also, it should be noted that Denmark is one of a few countries left in the EU with active conscription, in which all Danish males over 18 are required to serve from anywhere from 4 months to a year. Here, Denmark joined the EEC on the same day as Ireland and the UK, January 1st, 1973. Greece. Finally, the last country I'll be talking about for part 1 of this series. Greece has a long and rich history, and although the country's only official language, Greek, is really old and unique among European languages due to not using either the Latin or Cyrillic alphabet, ancient Greek and modern Greek are actually not very similar, and are actually really different in quite a handful of ways, which I'm not gonna go into. The flag of Greece has changed throughout the country's history, from the Greek monarchy to a military junta in between, all the way to a democratic republic that still stands all the way into the present day. But white and blue have remained the main colors. The modern Greek flag has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 horizontal stripes in alternating white and blue, with a blue square with a white cross in the top left. The white cross is symbolic of Greek Orthodoxy, which is the overwhelmingly predominant religion in the country. Surprisingly though, unlike in the case of other countries in the Balkans, Greece doesn't have a notably large Muslim minority, with Muslims only making up anywhere from 0.91 to 2% of the Greek population, most of whom live in Thrace. Just like Rome, the capital of Greece, Athens, is a famously really old city, and is also famous for being the birthplace of the concept of democracy. Speaking of democracy, while Greece was a monarchy for most of the time it was an independent state, starting from when it gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. Not so in the present day. Today, Greece has been a parliamentary republic ever since the end of the military junta, in which the president, who is elected by the Hellenic Parliament, is the head of state, and such role is mostly ceremonial, while the prime minister is the head of government. Greece, like most of the European Union, uses the euro, and is also another one of a handful of countries in Europe and or the EU that still have conscription, with Greek males aged 18 to 45 being required to serve in the armed forces from anywhere from 9 to 12 months. Now, there have been quite a few memes, especially in certain communities, about Greece's economy being in the dump, and it is true. Kind of. While Greece isn't doing too bad in terms of the size of its economy, with the country boasting the 16th largest economy in the EU. What Greece is doing really badly in is debt, with Greece having a debt to GDP ratio of 152%. Though it's not nearly as bad now as it was in 2020, when that same debt to GDP ratio was a whopping 207%. Unfortunately, Greece also doesn't do too well in terms of GDP per capita, with Greece having the second smallest GDP per capita in the European Union, only behind Bulgaria. That's not to say Greece is doing bad by any means. While the country is relatively poor by European standards, it's still doing a lot better than quite a few other countries. Greece joined the EU 8 years after Denmark and Ireland in 1981, a little over a decade before the EEC would become the EU. So there you have it, a compilation of all of my favorite videos of mine about the European continent concluded. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like, share, and subscribe, but only if you want to, really. And I'll see you in the next video. Edward from Edward279, signing out.